All right, hello and welcome, GCSE History students. If you're revising for your AQA paper on conflict and tension in Asia, then you have absolutely come to the right place. We're going to break this entire module down into a super clear, focused guide to get you completely exam ready.
Okay, let's get stuck in. Here's our game plan, and we've structured it to follow your AQA spec exactly. We'll kick off with the Korean War, then dive into how things escalated in Vietnam, and finally look at how that massive conflict came to an end. Let's do this.
Right. First things first. Before we can even begin to understand the wars in Korea and Vietnam, we've got to zoom out. We need to get a handle on the massive global struggle that was basically pulling all the strings from behind the scenes.
And that struggle, of course, was the Cold War. Now, this wasn't your typical war with American and Soviet soldiers fighting each other directly in trenches. No, this was a war of ideas, capitalism versus communism. And it was fought through smaller regional wars, what we call proxy wars. This global chess match is the absolute key to understanding everything that happened in Asia.
Okay, let's jump into our first case study, the Korean War. This is the moment where that Cold War suddenly turned scorching hot. We're talking about real, actual fighting. And this conflict became the first major military test of this new post-World War II world.
So what's so fascinating here is how you can see the whole Cold War conflict shrunk down into this one little peninsula. After World War II, Korea was literally sliced in two. Up in the north, you've got the communist Kim Il-sung with the Soviet Union and China backing him. Down in the south, you have the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee with the USA and the UN in his corner. Two opposite ideologies, two rival leaders, one country torn apart. I mean, it was just a ticking time bomb.
And this timeline just shows you the insane back and forth of the war. It's like a brutal seesaw. First, the North Koreans storm south and almost win the whole thing. Then, bam! A genius UN landing in Incheon completely flips the war on its head. But then, as UN forces get close to China, the Chinese army pours across the border, pushing them all the way back. And the result of all that? A bloody, grinding 2-year stalemate pretty much exactly where they started, along the 38th parallel.
So you might think, a stalemate, no big deal, right? Wrong. The consequences were absolutely huge. Korea was left shattered and permanently split into two. The UN proved it wasn't a total failure like the League of Nations, but it was pretty clear the US was calling the shots. Relations between the US and the new communist China went into a deep freeze for 20 years. But the biggest takeaway? For the United States, this war confirmed their worst fears, that communism was on the march and had to be contained no matter the cost. And that single idea would lead them right into the jungles of Vietnam.
And that very policy, that idea of containment, leads us straight into our next conflict, Vietnam. America's whole experience in Korea, that deep-seated fear of communism spreading, and the willingness to jump in with military force, would completely shape how they approach this even longer, bloodier, and more controversial war.
See, for years, Vietnam was a French colony. But after the French suffered a humiliating defeat at a place called Dien Bien Phu, they were out. The Geneva Agreement in 1944 carved the country in two, kind of like what happened in Korea. And as soon as the French left, boom, you've got this power vacuum. And guess who was desperate to fill it? Yep, the Cold War superpowers, each backing their own side.
Now, U.S. involvement didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden invasion. It was more like a slow creep. It started with President Eisenhower sending some money and a few military advisors. Then Kennedy came in and upped the ante, sending thousands more advisors and backing programs like strategic hamlets to try and win over the local population. It was like they were taking one small step after another, and before they knew it, they were in way too deep to just turn around. And it was all because of one powerful idea.
And this is it, the domino theory. This was the idea that was driving everything. American leaders genuinely believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, the whole of Southeast Asia would just topple, one after another, like a line of dominoes. So for them, this wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about holding the line against the spread of global communism.
Then President Lyndon Johnson comes along, and everything just explodes. A very controversial incident in the Gulf of Tonkin gave him the green light to send in hundreds of thousands of American combat troops. And you get this incredible clash of tactics. The Viet Cong with their guerrilla warfare, their tunnels and traps, versus the overwhelming power of the US with massive bombing runs and search and destroy missions. But the real turning point, the one you have to remember, is the Tet Offensive in 1968. Militarily, the Viet Cong were hammered, but psychologically, it was a knockout blow to the USA. It proved to everyone back home that the government had been lying about winning the war, and public support just collapsed.
The Tet Offensive was a bombshell. It changed absolutely everything for the American public and its politicians. So the question became, how on earth do we get out of this war that now looks completely unwinnable?
So President Nixon comes in with a new strategy. He called it Vietnamization. The plan was basically this. Let's train and arm the South Vietnamese army to do the fighting themselves so we can pull our troops out and claim we got peace with honor. But, and this is a really big but, what he said and what he did were two very, very different things. So while he's talking about peace and bringing the troops home, Nixon is secretly authorizing some of the heaviest bombing campaigns in history. He expands the war, invading neighboring Cambodia and Laos to try and destroy enemy supply lines. And all this did was create even more chaos in the region and spark massive, furious anti-war protests back home. And this leads us to a really critical question, one that's perfect for your exams. Vietnam was the first ever television war. Think about that. For the first time in history, the raw, uncensored horror of combat, things like the My Lai massacre, or seeing students shot at Kent State University, was being beamed directly into people's living rooms every single night. It created this huge credibility gap between what the government was telling people and what they could see with their own eyes.
Eventually, a peace deal, the Paris Peace Accords, was signed in 1973, and the last American troops finally left. But the peace was a sham. It didn't last. Just 2 years later, North Vietnam launched a final, massive invasion. Without American air power to save them, the South just crumbled, and those famous, heartbreaking images of helicopters frantically evacuating people from the embassy roof in Saigon in 1975, that was it. The definitive, humiliating end of the war for America.
Okay, deep breath. We have just raced through 25 years of really intense conflict. We've covered a huge amount. So let's take a second and boil it all down to the absolute must-know, non-negotiable points that you need to have locked in for your exam.
Here it is, your essential cram sheet. For Korea, you need to know the 38th parallel, that stalemate line, General MacArthur, the famous UN commander, and the Incheon landings, that game-changing moment. For Vietnam's escalation, you've got to know the domino theory, the reason America got involved, the Viet Cong, the guerrilla enemy, and the Tet Offensive, the massive political turning point. And for the end of the war, Vietnamization, Nixon's exit plan, Kissinger, the top diplomat who negotiated the peace deal, and the fall of Saigon in 1975, the dramatic final act. If you know these, you have a brilliant foundation for any top-level answer.
So that leaves us with the big picture question you need to be thinking about. Was American Cold War policy in Asia a success or a failure? You could argue that in Korea, containment actually worked. South Korea never fell to communism. But Vietnam, that was a clear, undeniable failure. So as you revise, keep asking yourself, did American intervention actually contain communism, or did it just show the limits of a superpower's power? That's the core debate. Get that straight in your head, and you'll be ready for anything. Good luck with your revision.